Yeah, thanks. Welcome, everyone. I know we're a few minutes after 3 p.m., so I think we'll get started. Um, Thank you all for being here. We're really excited to have this event and especially have our amazing speakers here with us today. So I can just start us off with a very brief introduction and then we can get into it. So my name is Arielle Lawson and I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Manchester. And my work has been with the social movement archives of the 1970s, looking particularly in New York City and London. But there's just been such an amazing wealth of materials that I think are really, fantastic way of learning about this history and also kind of have so much relevance today. So for this event, we really wanted to highlight kind of the richness of the materials. And so I'll give a brief introduction of the event, and we have our kind of collaborating organizations here at the bottom. So as you probably read from the description, the kind of aim of this event is really to highlight the materials and histories of Black activist publishing in the UK from the 1970s. And for this, we're using, we introduced this framework of the Black radical press, but really thinking about kind of this whole range of grassroots newspapers, political journals, and other kind of activist print publications that are so directly tied up to the activism. I think they can't really, like, they are so much of the activism too. And so thinking about these materials in reference to what we can kind of learn about these histories from today, but also what we can still kind of take with us, what's relevant to kind of ongoing struggles. With that, I will pass it over to Sarah from the George Padmore Institute, which I think has been one of the examples of the archives that has been kind of at the root of the inspiration for this event. So, Sarah, would you like to take it away?
Thank you. Hello. I'm Sarah. I'm from the George Padmore Institute, as Ariel has just said, and we're a small archive in Finsbury Park in London, and we're focused on the sort of Black British community between about the 1960s and the 1990s. And as part of that, our collection, we have a large amount of print media and Black radical press coming in alongside our collections relating to education, publishing, the arts, and sort of grassroots activism. So it's all really nicely sort of tied up together, and it cross-references a lot, which is something which is really great. And I'm just going to do a fairly brief overview here. I'm not going to go into any particular publication in any great detail, but I want to start by giving you some ideas, particularly relating to from the archivist perspective, particularly relating to the sort of preservation of those materials over time, any of the challenges that we've faced, and also the researchers that are coming to the organisation and what they're getting out of that material. We've just to start with, we've our late founding chair, John LaRose, fortunately, seems to have kept everything that passed through his hands, and we've been able to bring, numerous items of sort of print media, newspapers, journals, zines, newsletters, you name it, into the archive from his own papers, which has been great. And what I was going to start with really was just to think about the preservation of these materials, and also challenges and the value that they have. And I think, first of all, to think about this, it's remarkable that these materials actually exist at all now in many cases, because particularly fragile newspapers, you can see a number here, people like Freedom News and Black Voice and Hustler. They're all quite fragile, and when they were first distributed, they were shared, they were handled, read, put down, picked up again, left lying around in places which offer very little protection from daily life. Um, and, you know, but we've still got them, which is absolutely marvelous. I mean, they're still, in some cases, quite as I said, fragile. They're beginning to disintegrate. So we need to think about how we preserve those materials. I mean, journals, looking at the sort of journal side, like the Black Liberator and Forward and Race Today, they may have perhaps been put onto shelves, and because of that, and often the paper itself was a little bit thicker, but perhaps a bit more better quality in some cases. So I think that's offered a bit more long-term durability for those materials. But even so, things could easily have been thrown out or put aside and forgotten about. And so to have all this material across several archives and it's still available now, it's great. Sometimes we get more pristine copies actually turning up. And first of all, I started having alarm bells and thinking, was this a print run that went wrong and they didn't actually get given out? But I think it's also because they're spare copies from the distribution of the materials through, for example, shops and community hubs like the New Beacon Bookshop, which was co-founded by John LaRose, our late founding chair, and also Sarah White. So it's good to have those there as well. And people sometimes say to me, why is this in such good condition? And I think it's just because it wasn't used. It was probably a spare copy that was not actually given out and just put back into a box and was forgotten about. So we're lucky to have things like that in the archive as well. We can hit the barrier of duplication across collections. Archivists are often told, things should be rare, should be unique. We shouldn't be duplicating too much. But personally, I think it's really important to have this material next to the records where it's going to be used, because people find, them so useful, and actually to be told, sorry, we haven't got them here, you're going to have to go halfway across the country to see the collection you're looking for, can be quite frustrating. So if I can pull out a particular copy of a journal or a newspaper or a bulletin and have that side by side with something else, people are often really, really excited by that. Obviously a duplication, the more copies we have, the more that were printed and circulated, the higher the chance of survival. But there's also a chance when they turn up that you might actually decide to throw them away because there's already some out there, they're more widely disseminated, and then you find you haven't got any at all. So it works both ways. We've had some successful digitization projects, which people are going to be talking a bit more about this afternoon. I mean, digitization obviously is great in terms of preserving materials, particularly very, very fragile, newspapers. Grassroots is a newspaper that's really fragile in our own collections. But at the same time, people, when they can actually handle the original, they really, really like it. They feel that they really can get something from it because they can actually handle the paper. They get a sense of how it's put together, even simple things like, does it fall to pieces when you pick it up? Is it very, very solid? I mean, it sounds daft, but a lot of people really get something from that. And if you've got them digitized online, it sort of puts a bit of a barrier up somehow. They're at a distance. You can't interact with them, I don't think, quite as much as you'd like. But obviously, it's essential in many cases to make sure that these are preserved long term. So there is two dimensions, I think, to that. It's also, I find from an archival standpoint, actually getting funding for digitization can be difficult, again, because of the duplication aspect. I mean, I've had funding applications turned down because we're not the only people holding a certain set of records. And it can get a little bit frustrating when it's like that. But hopefully we can get more digitized and scanned as we go along. But we are quite a small organisation at the George Padmore Institute, so we have to work a little bit more slowly sometimes. When I began my first job in archives, I mean, I'm going back a number of years now, it was very common to start rejecting items that were considered ephemeral. And by that, things like leaflets, flyers, campaign literature, and swept up in that with things like newsletters, perhaps single page newsletters, small booklets. And, that's some of that is, it's print media that's it's out there, it's telling people what's happening. And, I remember at the time thinking, gosh, I really was questioning why this was being destroyed, because to me, it had a lot of information there, a lot of wealth of information, and I really wanted it to be kept. So, but obviously, I was very junior at that point, so I thought, well, okay, this is what you do in the profession. I better go along with this. But secretly, I was hoping that this would change, and thank goodness it has. I mean, a lot of archives now are actively collecting ephemeral things. I don't like the word ephemera, but collecting material that was, not intended to be kept long term, essentially. But there's people out there now actively collecting leaflets and flyers, and also things like the campaign literature, print media, and so on, that might have got swept up in that as well and be considered more ephemeral. I mean, looking at the screen in front of us here, I mean, perhaps something like Black RAM, the Black Regional Action Movement, that's it's a fairly small publication. It's just sort of pages stapled together. It perhaps would have been looked at and I thought, this is not a professionally printed, publication, and perhaps would have been rejected in favour of something like the Black Liberator there, where you have more a more professional looking cover and so on. And it's the content inside that's important. It's not just what it looks like and how it's made. It's the content inside that's really, really valuable to us. I was just really surprised when that first happened to me several years ago. I mean, I'm talking getting on for 20 plus years ago now. Anyway, thank goodness that's changed. So all these newspapers, journals, newsletters, brochures, etc., they're heavily used by researchers and other visitors that come to the George Padmore Institute and to many other archives. And they're essential, really. And I've just noted down a few reasons why I feel that they are essential. But by all means, we can discuss a lot more as we go along during the afternoon. I think such items preserve information about the organisations that issued them, and a lot of researchers actually are looking for that information that they can't find out elsewhere. It really sort of brings that all together in one little publication. You've got the whole story there in a lot of cases about what people stand for, what organisations stand for, how a campaign's been run, and so on. They also provide a platform where people could discuss their experiences in society at a sort of grassroots level. So you're getting sort of personal testimonies coming out through many of these publications, where you don't always get that from other documents as well. You've also got sources of more accurate information coming through, because there's a lot of distorted media coverage going on at the time of many of this print media coming out, and people obviously want the facts, they want the truth, and they go to sources like this, whereas mainstream media is putting out all sorts of it's a distorted media coverage, particularly around the late 70s, early 80s, and so on. Where you've got bulletins and things like that, small bulletins coming out It's their regular updates. They're helping to mobilize people, particularly in campaigns and movements and so on. And I think this is in rapidly developing situations and campaigns. And I think that helps researchers realize the momentum and the speed at which campaigns and so on are running, which again, you don't get necessarily through other documents when you're ploughing through working files and things like that. It's not always obvious the speed at which things are coming out. And of course, this is on an age where you've got no computers or anything like that. So the speed at which news is coming out and being published in a number of these print media, it's amazing, really, compared to, how things often, they got things out there far, far faster than some of the mainstream press, although in a number of cases it wouldn't even have been covered by the mainstream press. But it's really great. But I think above all, print media, I think, provides us with radical publications like this. They provide invaluable context for other historical materials. When you can read both alongside each other, it really helps to clarify the meaning, both of the other documents, but also as well, and it all helps to create a complete picture, basically, where you've got, say, internal working documents, and then you've got a final publication that's come out that's summarizing, a campaign or what's happening in society or whatever. It's so much easier for researchers to get a complete picture of what's happening. So I'm going to stop at that point because I'm rambling, and also I wanted to, I don't want this to be too long. I just want to throw out some ideas here to get you really thinking about what some of these publications are actually trying to do, but also the invaluable nature of those publications when carrying out research now and into the future. So we're going to be introducing now our guest speakers for the afternoon, and I'll leave it to Ariel to take this forward to our next speaker, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just pull up the slides, but then we're ready to take it away.
Okay, I'm assuming it's my turn. Briefly to introduce myself, my name is Leila Hassan Howe. I was an activist in the 70s and 80s, a political activist in the 70s and 80s in Britain. And I'm here to talk about Race Today, the publication Race Today, that was produced between the 70s to 85. And really just to talk about how, why, and what we did to bring some of the activism to life that are in these publications, which are in the archives. But firstly, I do want to thank the organizers for this session. Too often, when we look at history and when history of Black people in Britain is portrayed, which we now have to believe began with Windrush for the West Indian community and with the mass immigration from India and Pakistan as it was then in the 60s and 70s, the radical and revolutionary nature of these movements and these organizations is often overlooked. And because we live in the era of celebrity and of those who have status, who get recognition, I'm really pleased to be part of a discussion that recalls the radical and revolutionary movements of the 70s and 80s in Britain, only because I think all we have is our history. And at the moment, in many cases, that this history is being overlooked. And I'm going to talk about later about some of the initiatives that we have to make sure that this history isn't overlooked. So the way I want to approach this today is not to speak to each side, because there are quite a few of them, but I'm going to ask Ariel just to flip through the slides and I'll say a bit on each. But then I just want to talk about the kind of the overview of Race Today, why we did what we did and how we did it. Bearing in mind that what you see, that you are now going to see, was produced from a squat in Brixton, and that the editorial group that produced this lived off the dole from Brixton Labour Exchange. None of us were paid. And it just gives an idea of the creativity of that period and what it is that we were able to achieve. The collective at its height was 19 people. Four of us actually worked full time, and the rest had day jobs and would come and work in the collective after they had done their normal job. So just a brief introduction. We were 74 to 88. We were the epicenter really for the struggle for racial justice in Britain, in that we were a national magazine. And of course, Sophia is here, but she will know that Race Today was originally the house journal of the Institute of Race Relations. And with a palace coup, we broke away. And eventually, under the editorship of Darcus Howe, we moved to a squat in Brixton. And all that you're going to see now is produced from that squat in Brixton. And as this says, we weren't journalists. We were activists. This is a magazine produced by activists, and in our activism, we really talked about the struggle for Black power, the women's liberation, and the anti-colonial campaigns to free the Third World, as it was then called. And just to say that at the epicenter of what we did was race, sex, and class. And we were a national and international magazine, had many contacts. So this is myself and Darcus in the offices of Race Today, refurbished with the help of Ken Livingston, so it doesn't look too squat-like there. And we'll ignore the champagne on the table. We were obviously having a celebration, although as you can see, Darcus is working, and these were actually taken at the same time. So it's slightly embarrassing. Shall we move on? This is me in 71, protesting the death of George Jackson outside the American embassy. And just to, we put that there, well, when we discussed, we just wanted to show the kind of line of struggle, because I was very, very active in the Black Power movement in a group called the Black Unity and Freedom Party. And the thing with the Race Today Collective is that all of its members, barring maybe 2 or 3, were all part of the British Black Power movement of the 70s in Britain. This is Darcus, of course, a very famous mangrove trial, speaking outside of the mangrove. And again, the reason for showing these photos is to give you an idea of the level of protest, the level of consciousness that we had in that particular period, in terms of being absolutely opposed to what British society had in store for us, and for the depiction of British society of us. So this is the famous photo of Darcus. This is moving on to 81, but I put it there because and you can see John LaRose in the very bottom of the photograph with some of the parents of the New Cross fire, which I'm hoping that most people are aware of. I put this there because for us in Race Today, in the Black Parents Movement and Black Youth Movement, this was actually the culmination for us of the years of political struggle that we had done from the late 60s right through to the 80s. And the mobilization, I think you know this, today this remains the largest mobilization of Black people in Britain. For many of us, this was like our moment where we felt that all the struggles, all the police campaigns, housing, education, all the things we had done had culminated in this Black People's Day of Action. This is another visual of the Black People's Day of Action when the police tried to prevent the demonstration from crossing Blackfriars Bridge, even though the police had originally agreed that we could. And this eventually broke out into a fight, and some policemen did get injured, but this shows there. I've put this here because this shows a campaign in Bradford for George Lindo, who was framed for armed robbery and then eventually won his case because it was found that the policeman in his case was forging statements in, some of you may remember the Yorkshire Ripper case, or may know the history of the Yorkshire Ripper case of a man who was raping women. And the policeman who had framed George actually was found to be falsifying statements in that case. He was sent to prison, but this was a huge local campaign in Bradford, immortalised in a poem by Linton Kwesi Johnson. And this just shows you, again, the level of community resistance to what was going on. This is Black People's Day of Action again, and you can see the age of the demonstrators. I mean, average age was 18, I would think. I put this here because, again, although people know there was a Panther movement in Britain, this again shows us them on a demonstration. I wasn't in the Panthers, Darcus was, but again, it's, you know, the international nature of Black people all over the world are one, and that our movement very much had this international flavor. This is New Cross again with the children's faces of who were murdered, and again, you can see the age of the demonstrators there. The average age. This is East London. So this is the Anti-Racist Committee of Asians in East London. The woman in the middle, Marla Sen, was a member of the Race Today Collective. And this committee came out of the Bengali Housing Action Group. This Race Today was in the East End of London for 3 years, working with the Bengalis for them to get decent housing. And I will talk about that later. But from this came the patrols around the streets of East London because of the violence against Asian workers on Brick Lane and surrounding Brick Lane. And this is one of the demonstrations, as you can see, Marla at the centre for the Anti-Racist Committee. And I think Siddiqui Khan has actually made a mural of Marla down in East London. I'm not sure if it's still there. So, yep, moving on. So this now gives an overview of Race Today and the work that we did. So although Race Today was a magazine, we also felt it was really important to have a small publishing house. So we used to publish very small pamphlets that were easily accessible to people to kind of encourage the intellectual debate, the kind of political debate around what we were doing and why. And these are just, as we skip through these, this just gives you an overview of the range of the publications that we put out. We were very close to the Bradford community through George Lindo, and this was the kind of small pamphlet that they produced, I think, monthly at the time. And then, yes, and I'm just trying to show the range of culture, politics, the international nature of what we did and what we believed in as we produced these small booklets. The struggle of Asian workers in Britain is just a compilation of all the different strikes, all the movements of Asian workers in Britain at that time, from the women's strike in Imperial Typewriters to all the shop floor factory strikes. And this primarily is a pamphlet of interviews with the workers themselves, who talk about their history, their fight against colonialism, the defeat of the kind of promise of colonialism, their arrival in Britain, and basically why they were here and what they hoped for. This is CLR again. Moving on. You can see here Walter Rodney, very famous Guyanese historian, and CLR here discusses why Walter ended up dead and talked about the politics and the failure of our kind of politics to have kept Walter alive. So quite an important publication. This is Darcus on the Police. This Black Women's Critique of Literature, Theatre and Film by Aqua Rug. We were very keen to promote culture and literature. We saw there was no kind of distinction between politics, art and culture, and so produced Aqua's reviews of the theatre and the film that she'd been to. This is a dead poet, stoned to death in Jamaica, who we brought to England to perform, electric performer, and again, we published that. Road Make to Walk on Carnival Day. This is the struggle to keep West Indian Carnival on the streets in Britain. At that time, there was a huge campaign led by the police and the local government to take Carnival off the streets of Notting Hill. 50 years later, it's still on the streets. But if you're aware of the debate about Carnival, every year we have the debate as to, is Carnival too big for Notting Hill? But this outlines the really vigorous campaign waged by the police and the local government in the 70s to get it off the streets. And of course, this culminated in the battle to keep Carnival in 76, when the police received an absolute hiding from the Black youth after they tried to over-police it. So I think that's it. This is just to say, we, our little catalogue that we have here. And yeah, moving on. If we just show the last one. So there was a television program called Bandung, which was very much informed by Race Today. And so this, again, it was produced by us to encourage this Channel 4 program to be seen and for people to look back. And the BFI are actually doing a retrospective on Bandung on the 2nd of March at the BFI. So if anyone's in London at the time, you'll find it interesting to see what they're showing. There's been a bit of a fuss because they didn't invite Tariq Ali to actually speak on it, and he was one of the main producers of Bandung Fung, but that's now all been resolved. And every year we produced a cultural issue, first edited by Linton Kwesi Johnson. And what we tried to do was look back on the year, on the political and cultural movements of that year, and then have a more in-depth analysis and discussion about it. You can see Memories of Ireland. We published Gerry Adams's memory of growing up in Ireland, because at that time, Ireland was part of the kind of international political consciousness of the Black movement. We felt, you know, of our brothers and sisters who were fighting against colonial Britain. And so you can see, but again, it just gives you an idea of the range of what Race Today did. We had our own football tournament. We were fortunate to have CLR James living with us, so we'd always ask him to review cricket. But just to give you an idea, and to remember, this is all being produced manually, because we didn't have any equipment until we were helped by Ken Livingston from a squat in Brixton. We're laying this out, we're designing it, we're putting lines in when it's been read by Darkus and myself, and we found errors. We would then actually typeset a line and stick it down on a piece of paper. So I think that's it, isn't it? And again, the review, again, talking about music, Linton talking about the direction of reggae, the debate around Bob Marley that was going on at the time. So yeah. Then to the journal itself, very quickly, this is just to give you an overview again of the range and depth of what we were able to do because of our international support, of our national support, of people wanting to support Race Today and write for Race Today. Because at that time, we really wanted to enhance the debate. It wasn't just to complain and say we're being oppressed, but for ourselves to analyze what we were doing, and for ourselves to really up the discourse on what we were doing in Britain at this time, what were our possibilities for change, and then how we could go about making that change. And I think there's just a couple more to show the range of Race Today. As I've said, Race Today was a collective. It was made up of Asians, Indians, Pakistanis, people from the Caribbean, people from Africa, people like myself who were born here, although I was partly educated in Tanzania. So it was, I mean, I think the kind of way people talk about it now is political blackness. We did not call ourselves politically black. We were people who were just working together for change. And just finally, the last one to talk about is We Freed Darkus. This is Darkus being sentenced to 3 months in prison by a judge in Knightsbridge, who actually said when he sentenced him to prison, "Mr. Howe, you are a very arrogant man." He said nothing about the charge, which I think was ABH or assault, nothing at all about, "I found you guilty for the charge. Mr. Howe, you are a very arrogant man, and I'm sending you to prison for 3 months." We mobilized an international and national campaign to get Darkus out of jail. And he tells a story himself that he's in prison. He was in Pentonville, locked up with an Irish prisoner called Lofty, and he would exchange his banana to write lofty love letters. But he tells us the story that when he was coming for his appeal, which we were able to get within 2 weeks, the prison wardens and everybody told him, "You are not coming back here." And so we were able to free Darkus from his prison sentence. And this is him outside the Royal Courts of Justice where the prison sentence is held. And this just gives you some idea of the power of what we had at that time, that we were able to get him freed in that way within a couple of weeks from prison after he'd been sentenced. And just more again about the international flavor and the kind of range of culture, politics, art that Race Today depicted through the 70s and 80s. So I think we've talked, Sarah might have mentioned John DeRose, who was the leader of the Black Parents Movement. This is the demonstration in Bradford to free George Lindo. So I think that's the kind of overview that I want to give. I'm going to talk a bit about the East End housing struggles, as that was one of the pivotal movements that Race Today did. So I think we can leave it there, Aria. Now, just like to talk and have these going on in the background. So you would have seen my second slide was From Victim to Protagonist, The Changing Social Reality. This was an editorial we produced in 1974 because it defined our political approach to what we felt society did not know who the immigrant community were, nor did they care to know. Linton Kwesi Johnson has talked about this and said, at that time in the 70s, we weren't second-class citizens. We were below third-class citizens. We were completely marginalized, and established society either saw us as helpless victims or as people who were here to cause trouble. And that kind of trouble thing very much represented itself in what was happening to West Indian house parties and the police arresting West Indians in house parties, breaking them up. Much of this has been discussed in Steve McQueen's excellent television series. And also how the police basically did see their role as containing the Black community, and particularly young Black men at that time. So we were seen as poor, helpless victims that needed to be supported to integrate, to assimilate into British superior ways. This view was supported by the Church, by the Community Relations Commission, and other statutory bodies. But for us in the 70s, we were part of and we witnessed the growth in community, social and cultural organizations and the growing militancy on the shop floor by Asian and West Indian workers in particular at Ford's, and Asian workers in the foundries and textile industries in the Midlands and in the north of England. The editorial argued that to persist in this victim theory was distorting our reality. And we also highlighted that liberal institutions, in particular the race relations industry, and by then that time we're talking about the Community Relations Commission, who had local offices in every single immigrant community, were prime agents of social control. And we defined our task as recording and recognizing these struggles of the newly emerging social forces of Black revolt. So how did we do this? We were a small organization. We were fortunate enough to have C.L.R. James, the noted historian, who was Darcus's great uncle, discuss with Darcus and with us at the time of the need for a small activist organization who produced a magazine. The magazine, and at that time was, as has been discussed with no social media, was the only way we could get our voice heard, but that the magazine we had to speak to each other in order to define our politics, in order to understand what was possible for us and what we could do about it. We needed to talk to each other and we need to publish with each other. Up until then, Race Today, when it was in the Institute, was much more a kind of looking at what the status quo's views were of us. And we were very much about, let's have our own views of us and let's really discuss about what's possible. As I've said before, all of us were influenced by Black power organizations. Most of the magazines that Sarah had in her presentation would have been influenced by the Black Panthers in the United States. In fact, many of the local Black papers that were produced nationally, we just adopted, as we did in Black Unity and Freedom Party, as Grassroots did, as the Panthers did, adopted the 10-point program and just adapted it to Britain as our view of the way forward. So Race Today is a kind of development of the Black Power movement. And what distinguishes us as having been a member of the Black Power movement, I can say, because the ideology is very much performed by, I was in a Marxist-Leninist group, couldn't tell you at all what it meant. We had our leadership who were Marxist-Leninists, and the rank and file, maybe 200 people who were basically more interested in Black power, the Panthers and freedom. So there was that disconnect. But in Race Today, and we have to say we had an ideology, we discussed our ideology in terms of being radical and revolutionary. We wanted change, but we also realized that if we were to take the Black community forward, we need to analyze Britain. We need to analyze the state of Britain, our relationship in it, and therefore carve out what we thought was possible. So we decided not to concentrate on what was being done to us. There were other bodies like the Runnymede Trust who were doing it, constantly saying these are the latest proposals from the Labour government as it was then, later the Tories. So we said we're not going to concentrate on what's being done to us, although we are going to respond and react to it. But what we're going to do is enrich the discourse and on our strategies, linking our struggles not only in the UK, but also internationally, and produce a journal that would really encompass all of this, which I think the covers have shown. As I've said before, we did the design, we did the layout, we did everything ourselves. Of course, we had support from white colleagues who came in who had more expertise. We were printed by a radical press at that time called the Russell Press, which I think many of the Black organizations at that time used, named after Bertrand Russell. And they would, of course, print us because many printers would not print what we were doing. And side by side with that, we were activists. We were supporting strikes. We were supporting campaigns against the police, housing struggles, education struggles, struggles and supporting international campaigns. And of course, with the support of Linton and other cultural people within us, we were also discussing where we were culturally, where we were in theatre, in art, and we put on art exhibitions. And this was all done under the banner of something called Creation for Liberation. So one of the first things that we published was an article by John LaRose, and it was called "We Did Not Come Alive in Britain," because what we felt also for this second generation and for other people was to know that there was a rich anti-colonial struggle in India, in Pakistan, and in the Caribbean, which many of the people who had emigrated to England from had been part of. And it was the collapse of that anti-colonial struggle that had brought on invitation many of the immigrants to Britain. So John analysed the colonial struggle and also predicted that eventually there would be an internal class struggle within different immigrant communities in Britain. And of course, when we come on, I think, to some of the other presentations, we will talk about what's going on there. So as an activist in these struggles, I just want to highlight 3 campaigns really, really briefly, and Ari, you're going to tell me when I'm overrunning. So the first one I want to highlight is the Bengali Housing Action Group. As I said, when we were looking at the slides, we were in the East End for 3 years. I used to go down regularly to the East End with Marla, Farouk. We made, the brief background is this: there was a corrupt community relations officer called Abu Buya who was selling squats to Bengalis. These were empty properties and he was selling them to Bengalis. He was taking rent from them. And this was brought to our attention. We had a telephone call to the office and all it said is this Race Today? I understand you help Black people. And we're in the East End and we've got some problems. So Marla and Farouk went down there, Marla primarily, and understood what was going on and realized that these people were being completely exploited by their own, Mr. Abu Buya, to be sold properties that were in fact empty. But at that time, it was the Greater London Council who owned these properties. So we supported them in a huge squatting movement. At that time, as when we squatted the offices of Race Today, you could get electricity, you could make an arrangement with the Electricity and Gas Board and with the local council, and they would allow you to live in these properties for peppercorn rent or for nothing at all. So we arranged all of that with them. But the thing that stood out to me, I think, when I look back on that struggle, was we decided we would go and picket the town hall. And at that time, most of the meeting, I have to say, were Muslim men. And when we were talking about it, Marla said to them, you know, you have to bring your wives and your daughters to have this protest. And they said, okay. And when we got outside the town hall, because many of these women had never been on such a protest, they just lay down on the town hall steps. I mean, that was their way of just lying there. And when the councillors came out, they just said, oh my God, what is happening here? So after a 3-year struggle with the support of the squatting movement in East London, we were able to get them all housed by the Greater London Council. All of them were given houses. And for us, again, that shows what was possible at that time with power and organisation to achieve our aims. I was also one of the main supporters of the Imperial Typewriter Strike. This is the first strike of Asian women from Uganda, who, when working with other workers side by side in Imperial Typewriters, realized that they were getting less pay. And so with the help of an organizer called Benny Bunsey, who was an Asian from South Africa, we called the Imperial Typewriter Strike. And this again was a successful strike. So at that time, you have to understand that when people went on strike, they had no union support. So not only were they fighting the employers, they were also fighting the unions because the unions would not recognize this. There was great hostility, some of which we're seeing now from workers to immigration. And the unions were very much like, you're just lucky to be here and have a job. And so will not support these women. So again, we mounted an international struggle. We asked our comrades in the United States to picket the offices there. And this again is another very successful campaign that we fought. I want to talk about the struggle for Carnival, again, just mentioned very briefly. There was a sustained campaign over 2 or 3 years to get Carnival off the streets of Notting Hill, led by the police. Within that pamphlet, you will see a photograph of a policeman holding out maybe a 2-yard long petition, which he presents to say that the local residents of Notting Hill do not want Carnival in this area. And that went on with the police just increasing their presence and making it more and more uncomfortable for the carnivalists to perform. And at that time in the 70s and 80s, there was very much a much kind of different kind of nature to carnival. Now a lot of carnival is around sound systems. But then when in the 70s, you might have 7 or 8 steel pans marching down the road, beating pan, as well as huge mass bands. So we, in Race Today, we thought, well, if we're to be part of this campaign, we need to form our own carnival group, which we did. We were called the Race Today Carnival Band. We linked up with the Mangrove, who were our steel band. And for 3 or 4 years, we produced our own masks, which we thought was revolutionary because we didn't have glitter, but it always had revolutionary themes. So it was around the life and times of Emiliano Zapata, the Mexican Revolution, forces of victory, depicting the freedom struggles of Frelimo, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. We built a tank over a car. We built an aeroplane and went down to the streets of Notting Hill. And we did the kingdoms of Benin and Ife. There's a debate now, and you might have seen in the news how the British Museum is saying it's going to return some of the beautiful artifacts to Benin and Ife that have been housed in the British Museum since colonial times. And we did a whole mass band around that. And then Kingdoms of the Forest, talking about the activism of in those times of the kind of peasantry against the ruling class. So always revolutionary themes. And eventually, I don't want to say that we were kind of the arbiters of making carnival exist now. It's now in its 50th anniversary in 76 in the form that we know. Darkest Democrat tried to make a democratic structure to run carnival, saying that carnival should be run by the people who produced the masks, the steel bandsmen, the sound systems, that they should run it. Where, of course, there was the counter thing of carnival is a business. If you have all these people here, we can make money. And there's always been that tension in carnival, but we held the opposing view. But what really kept carnival on the streets is the Battle of 76, when the police sent hundreds of policemen to over-police carnival, to restrict carnival, to really prevent us from playing mass, and the youth fought back. And again, this pamphlet will kind of show how that just changed, and we've been successful to date, although, as I say, every year there's the same debate of is carnival too big? But again, successful. And then finally, George Lindo. George Lindo was like to have a bet. And when he left the betting shop, he was arrested by this police officer. He was framed for armed robbery. We had a huge campaign. We had radical lawyers, Gareth Pearce, who some of you may have heard of, Ian MacDonald, who's since passed. And we did the legal campaign for George. We did the political mobilization from George. Many of us went to Bradford. We hired coaches from London, went to support George, but we weren't successful. And George was sent to prison, to Armley Jail. So we went to Armley Jail in Leeds and we picketed Armley Jail. But eventually, as I've said, it was found out that the police officer who had framed George was corrupt. And so George was finally released to his family, I think maybe a year later. I mean, he did spend some time in prison. But again, the length and the kind of consistency of organization that we had at that time, I think is something which I'm really just trying to depict about Race Today and the collective we had. I've tried to bring to life some of what we did, because I want to say that although I'm really appreciative of the archive and many people who've asked to interview me because they have been to George Padmore. So, you know, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to the organizers of this. But sometimes when I read the analysis, I think, really, did we? Okay. And I understand that it's very difficult for academics and for people to look at history through the eyes of those who actually did it without putting your own spin and your own assessment on what we did. So really my aim today was to say, this is what we did. This is how we did it. When I look back myself, I am amazed that from a squat in Brixton, all of this was done. I mean, I have to tell you, the art exhibitions that we put on, many of the famous artists like Lubaina Himid, Denzel Forrester, Sonia Boyce, of course. Many of them had their first exhibitions that we did in Brixton, in a church in Brixton, and we did 3 art exhibitions. When I look back on the range and depth of what we did, I have to say it's because we were in a movement. There were so many like-minded people like us. I haven't talked about the white left in Britain. Their support, I mean, many of them opposed what we were doing because we were an independent Black organization. We can talk about that. The left in Britain at that time, I'm not saying now, IS, IMG, the Communist Party, quite strong organizations, but all divided on what Russian politics, what the division was with Trotsky and Lenin in Russia. And so for that didn't speak to us. And then they were, you know, very much wanting to, as they do now, have this kind of vanguard position of where they're in the lead. And Race Day was totally opposed to vanguard politics. We listened, we recorded, we recognized, we were governed by what the people themselves wanted to do. And we would support that, but also introduce ideas of how we had to have radical struggle. And as I said, the culmination for us is 81, the Black People's Day of Action. And the Black People's Day of Action really encompasses many of the things I've spoken about today, because all of the parents to a person will tell you that when they said they were going to join the Black People's Day of Action, the church, the community relations officials, social workers, all of them said to the parents, you must not go down that militant route. And that we were successful in keeping the parents with us, mainly because of how the Black People's Day of Action was organized. Although Steve McQueen's film shows that, he doesn't show the political organization that went in there. The New Cross fire was in January the 18th, 81. We called the Black People's Day of Action at the beginning of March. So that was the period in which we had to make a national mobilization for this demonstration. It came about because a Black worker from Ford's got up and said, we need to have a Black strike. And that moved into the Black People's Day of Action, which we would march through London on a working day so that we could disrupt London. Police were totally opposed to us. You cannot cross Blackfriars Bridge. You're not going into the city of London and disrupt workers. March down Fleet Street to complain about how the press hadn't covered this fire at all. And we just insisted that that's what we were going to do. The reason the police allowed us was because they had special branch in our meetings, and they were telling them that it was a pretty free-bile atmosphere. And many of the young Black youths were saying, it's time for us to pick up guns and go and shoot these fascists. So they knew the temperature. And so in the end, they conceded, although they did try to stop us at Blackfriars Bridge. But for us, that really encapsulated everything, because you had the state who were using their own agents to try and control the march, to try and prevent the parents and the brothers and sisters of the dead children from going near that. They would say that John LaRose and Darcus Howe, they're radicals, you know, you shouldn't go anywhere near them. And we would go into the house and they'd say, oh, the police were just here. And the police told us we shouldn't have anything to do with you. So police, social workers, church, everybody. And they failed, and we were able to pull off the Black People's Day of Action. So again, I'm going to end there, and thank you all very much for listening to me. And I hope I've given you a bit of insight into who we were and what we did. Thank you.
Thanks. Nigel, would you like to share next?
Hey. Well, so thanks very much, Leila. That was great. And what I'm going to talk about is a struggle kind of from maybe a bit before that time. But the reason for looking at this was working with the tenants union in Moss Side to think about how to make that tenants union anti-racist. So there were lots of issues with race being a barrier to communication, effective participation in the union. And it came out in Moss Side because people from the council housing in Moss Side joined the tenants union, discovered it was largely white. A number of the organisers and officers were homeowners. And the focus was very much on the private rented sector. So it kind of raised a set of questions. And I'm kind of go back in time and can remember Kath Locke talking to me about housing struggles in Moss Side against slum clearance. Unfortunately, I didn't listen to her enough. So we went and kind of had a look at archival material to try and find out what was going on. So so first of all, there was a lecturer at Manchester University who'd done lots of work with the local council for community relations, a lot of stuff around housing, around surveys of people who were part of who were living in that community, and some of those insights were quite useful. We also went to the Amadou Balola Race Relations Resource Archive, which is in Central Library in Manchester now, using copies of Moss Side News and other related collections, and finally to George Padmore Institute, and I'll explain why in a bit. So looking at what the Robin Ward found out, it showed that 32% of West Indians in Moss Side own their homes compared to 13% of UK residents. And anecdotally, that's partly to do with a different set of expectations and a different acceptance by some of the landlords. And similarly, so Moss Side became a place that was associated with people from the new Commonwealth. And there was a whole set of issues around how the housing was distributed between those. So when the first proposals came for slum clearance, it was the area at the back of the university that was the first, and a housing action group was set up. And it was a typical example, I suppose, of what happened in those days. So they produced a newsletter, 1,500 copies distributed through all of the local newsagents. It was sold for 6p a copy, and all of those copies went. They had mass buy-in from local residents, and produced a fortnightly paper to start with. And they articulated this set of demands, which I'm going to just leave up for those who might want to look at them, and hopefully this will be shared as well. But in effect, they were saying everybody here should be treated equally, and we should be involved in planning what happens to the places we live in. And they demanded planning, and these are some of the quotes. So it's the experts who should be asking for permission to participate in our lives. The experience of Hume, which is a neighbouring district that was redeveloped, pretty quickly became defined unfit for families with children, and the move to build overspill estates way outside of the city. And the kind of question was, who is this city being built for? The corporation refused to engage with that, and the local Conservative council made these two quotes. So one referred to the People's Association and Housing Action Group being taken over by the Black Power boys. And he was also kind of lined up with the Monday Club, so he is also part of that send them back type of campaign that eventually led to kind of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood. But it was that continuation of that 50s group, the Monday Club, anti-immigrant people who led to the first immigration controls, and then onwards to the kind of hostile environment we live in today. So one of the clear things about this kind of compulsory purchase was that it forced people, for those who owned their homes, it kind of forced them into social housing or into council housing at the time, because the compensation through the compulsory purchase scheme wasn't adequate for them to be able to reinvest in a house. And therefore, when they were dependent on council housing, they were forced into overspill estates. So Hattersley is probably 15 miles away, but at the point it was built, there was very little transport. So for young people who came back into Moss Side for social reasons, getting back was quite often not possible. So this, I think, was one of Gus's first jobs in Manchester, was working as a youth worker and getting this hostel set up so that young black people could stay and be safe from being hassled on the street or arrested by the police. So what we got from the Housing Action Group was very much a picture of community resistance, informing people what their rights were, helping them go through and identify what they could do, building a collective consciousness, demanding for involvement in planning and so on. But what wasn't obvious from those papers was the role of race in it. Given we were trying to find out how this would inform anti-racist struggle, we then went to look at Black Voice and to the George Padmore Institute to explore this. And these two pages are from the first issue. So talking about Moss Side, so that looks like an area that was being cleared at the time. And this is, I presume, Kath Block talking, who was in the Black Unity and Freedom Party. It sounds very much like her voice to me. And, you know, she was a very strong activist at that point. And it's quite an amazing paper, just to read anyway, just to skim through. Because this is 1969, 1970. We're talking about resistance on a scale to state intervention that built a mass movement to resist. So I think what I would come back to is saying housing is a focus of Black-led struggle. It has been continuously. Leila referred to the East End of London, and somebody mentioned Shabnir Begum's book about From Select to Spitalfields, which is a great account of that squatting movement and the broader environment within which it operated. But the housing struggle in Moss Side was inclusive. I suppose it represented everybody who was in the areas under threat. The analysis, the political analysis provided by Black Voice was really useful because it linked together the class and race perspectives on what was going on, and clearly articulated something that I think is still very important and not being delivered. Housing is a basic need. Everyone needs somewhere to live. It's essential for a good life, and so on and so on. And I think what we have moved from is a recognition of that, the signing up to the UN Charter that said housing is a basic human right, to a position we are now where housing is no longer a basic human right. It's conditional on whether you can afford it, on your citizenship status, and so on. So that was a kind of very useful political insight. So let's just tell you what happened in the story. So this is Moss Side. The area number 1 was the first clearance area. That's just behind the university. Number 2 is on one side of Princess Parkway. For those who know Manchester, that's what is now the Alexandra Park estate. And the other side is kind of terraced houses, turn of the 19th, 20th century terraced housing. So the previous clearance of Hume had, as I said, left people with a very poor kind of impression of what would happen. Phase 1 of the clearance of Moss Side was completed in 72, and people were rehoused in overspill estates. There's a couple of pictures there of places in the phase 2 and 3. Phase 2 cleared the land occupied by Alexandra Park estate, and people were being rehoused there, but nobody who'd been displaced from Moss Side already. And phase 3 was never started. And I think what was interesting to read about here was another person had done a PhD on their involvement in the resistance to the third clearance. They were organising, but it was funded by state funding. It was one of the I can't remember what they called that scheme at the time, but basically you had somebody employed temporarily by the state to do things like work in the community. And this person was then, in effect, a full-time organizer for the campaign. When they collected information, they didn't engage with the households in the way that the previous work had done. So there was a kind of hole in that set of resistance. And I think if you look now, you can see that Moss Side has transformed itself from largely kind of social housing, would have been council housing, and a lot more housing associations and a much larger private rented sector. Again, for those of you who know the geography of Manchester, there is a real kind of looming threat from things like Airbnb, from student accommodation, because those pay much better where the houses are owned. And in the housing associations, those are kind of staying, but there has been issues about neglect and lack of maintenance. So to conclude, for me, the archives were central to exploring this story. And the radical papers from the 60s and 70s helped to kind of identify the underlying ideologies and ways of thinking that were implicit in those struggles, because those weren't articulated. What I saw in the Housing Action Group papers were information for the whole of the community. So clearly there were radical things happening behind it, knowing the participants in it, but it was in papers like Black Voice where you could get at the kind of debates going on, the way that people are analysing that situation. And I think it's quite interesting, kind of reflecting on that, is that those activists, for them, I think it was implicit the way that race and class operated, both nationally and internationally, that was part of the language, the currency of that time. Whereas we often are talking about discovering that. For younger activists, we have to go through a journey of learning that. So I think one of the big contributions of these archives is to offer some political education for activists to engage with a collective history. I would say for me, doing it with a purpose, like working with a tenants union, made it particularly useful because it produced something which leaves something, but just to do it as a way of understanding how those struggles happened and what ways of organizing were once you overcome this having to be well, I don't know, let's think about a university and the training in unconscious bias that they keep on telling me every year that I need to do. The way the institutions respond to race, the whole EDI agenda, is something that I find really difficult to engage with. Yet so much of activism since probably the funding of the 80s has been tied to that EDI professional agenda.
Yep.
So I'm going to stop there and open it to finish off the session and then go to questions.
And I think, yeah, we'll have one more presentation from Sophia. And I know we're running a little bit behind, but if people do want to put their questions in advance in the Q&A box, we can already start looking at those too. So yeah, Sophia, if you're ready.
Yep, let me just share my screen. There we go. Okay, can you see that? Thanks. Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me here today. It's been amazing so far. I'm Sophia. I work at the Institute of Race Relations, and I'm the joint editor of its journal Race and Class. And I just wanted to start by briefly situating the IRR in the 1970s, because I think it's a really interesting history. So the IRR was originally a policy-orientated colonial institution that very much served the ruling elites, but in 1972, it was transformed by its members into a radical anti-racist think tank that placed the needs of all those affected by racism at its centre. And the IRR's dry, very academic journal, Race, was changed to Race and Class. And at this stage, Race Today, which was originally part of the Institute, that was when they went to the squat in Brixton. And in Race and Class Today, we continue to publish the words of scholars and activists who examine racism, imperialism, and capitalism, as well as resistance to it. And here are a few examples of sort of the issues that we cover. So you can see Palestine and Ireland, the roots of resonance, the criminalisation of drill lyrics, housing struggles in Britain, domestic workers in Sao Paulo. So you can really see the sort of range that we cover. And the IRR has an archive called the Black History Collection, which compiles material from the anti-racist movement from the 50s to the 80s. And it includes over 160 journals, including Race Today, publications such as Black Voice, Freedom News, Samaj, and also when the Black women's movement emerged in the late 1970s, they also brought their own publications, and we have those in our archive as well. And you can view this archive at the London Archives, where it's accessible. So today I'm going to draw on a few examples and highlight some of the key themes that our speakers have already sort of touched on today. So yeah, the first thing I wanted to mention was the importance of recording state racism. And yeah, to emphasize what other speakers have said, this was a time when social media didn't exist. So community papers were really a place of record where you could share your experiences of state racism and what was happening on the ground, particularly in context of distortion, which Sarah mentioned, and the distortion of history and the distortion of struggles. And this is an example called the Black People's News Service, published by the Black Panthers. And I really like this quote about how sharing the work of the struggle was an important act of solidarity, and it was very much seen as a corrective and a part of the struggle. And journals provided a space for theory and praxis to come together, blending analysis on the roots of systemic oppression with grassroots organising. And The Black Liberator was a theoretical discussion journal which contains analysis that continues to be incredibly resonant today. And in a 1978 report by one of its founders, Colin Prescott, he writes about the formation of Black People Against State Harassment campaign, which emerged in response to police violence. But I found this really interesting that he begins his account with an analysis of fascism, which I think is really useful. So he says, "We've got something to tell Europeans. Their fascism is still alive and kicking in their civilization. The black masses have been seeing the fascist face of the state in Britain since the 50s. Perhaps those Europeans who fear and abhor fascism and who look back to the 30s for their fascism, were they to look closely at the black experience in Britain, would find that they have been looking the wrong way." And I think this is such a powerful critique, which really highlights how state repression and particularly police violence is a key manifestation of fascism, something that is still overlooked today by very time-barred analogies of what fascism is, which is often still being debated between anti-fascist and anti-racist groups. And I really feel that consulting with such historical analysis can give us eyes to really understand how some of the same tensions we work through today have also been worked through in the past. And the Black women's movement, which emerged in the late 1970s as a response to mainstream women's liberation movement, who didn't see racism as part of their remit, and also in response to the Black liberation movement, which neglected issues of sexism, and women felt that they needed their own spaces to discuss issues affecting them, but also the community as a whole. And they brought with them their own periodicals, which were incredibly important for articulating a collective politics that was accessible, as well as bringing people together on the ground. And the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent was an umbrella movement that campaigned on issues impacting Black and Asian women, including immigration, domestic violence, and health. And it published this newsletter, FOAD, which provided information on the issues impacting Black women and the wider community and mobilised support for campaigns. And key to FOAD was providing women with a space to share their views, to pass on information and to call for support in their campaigns. And I think this phrase really sums it up, that OAD is for all of us, FOAD belongs to all of us, make it your mouthpiece, sister. And it really reflects the collective politics that they put in practice. And it was also a very practical newsletter with information printed on the back about how to get involved with working groups and women's groups across the country, showing how the newsletters were an organising tool which really helped enable building relationships and bringing people together on the ground. And as well as building support for local campaigns, the Black Radical Press was a really key vehicle for linking racism in Britain with imperialism and forging a radical internationalist politics that transcended borders. And Samaj here was an anti-racist and anti-imperialist paper that covered issues impacting people from the Caribbean and South Asia. And news of local self-defense campaigns were printed alongside the National Front in resistance against the National Front in Blackburn, Nottingham, and Newcastle, and also featured alongside reporting from liberatory struggles in Angola, Mozambique, and South Africa, which gives you a sense of the internationalism. And this movement between the local and the global in the pages enacts the politics that you can't understand racism in Britain without understanding the role of imperialism. And this perspective is still incredibly important today, especially in context of multiple genocides that are upheld by global systems of capitalism. So I wanted to end just by thinking about some of the resonances between the Black Radical Press and the present day. And I was really struck by this paragraph published in the 1976 issue of Samaj, that was published after the killing of 18-year-old Gurdeep Singh Chaggar, who was stabbed to death in a racist attack in Southall. And I'll just read it out. So, resistance has been the keynote of events in Britain this summer. Black people for long, targets of racialist attack and abuse, have stood up for their rights and dignity and refused to be intimidated. Asian youth have been at the forefront of this movement. They've begun to take up the urgent task of organising the defence of their own neighbourhoods against fascist attacks. The Labour government has taken no positive steps to stem the tide of racialism and come out firmly for stricter immigration control, underlying the common racist assumption that immigrants are a problem and the most urgent task is to limit the numbers coming in. And I just think reading this 50 years later, there's just so many clear parallels today where we've seen the far right orchestrated racist violence and a Labour government who has imposed stricter immigration controls in response, working to embolden the far right and ultimately blame migrants for the issue. And we explore some of these issues and particularly how Reform, the Conservatives and the Labour government approach immigration in a recent report called Enforcing Britishness. But also, on a more hopeful note, we've also seen a return to community self-defense movements. And we've seen communities coming out to defend their own communities, particularly against the far right. So just a few examples. In Whitechapel, thousands came out into community self-defense last year in response to UKIP's attempted march. And in Manchester this Saturday, in response to Britain First calling a march, a coalition of groups are organising a big counter demo and mobilising under the very historic slogan, here to stay, here to fight. And I find it really interesting that they're actively using archival imagery in their posters as well. And also on a global level in the US, in response to ICE raids, campaigns rooted in self-defense have taken action across the cities in a way that seems completely unprecedented, including neighborhood patrols, know your rights training, and neighbors buying food for each other for people that can't leave their homes. And I just wanted to end with these examples because I think such actions show us that the ideas and the themes and the visions that are contained in the Black radical press are not contained to a particular historic period, but they're very much activated today in the present. And as we see an emergence of these forms of community self-defense, I think it's really powerful to think of such resistance as part of a long arc of struggle, which can really give us power in the present day. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I think, yeah, all of those presentations were really amazing in capturing, I think, what we were hoping this event would kind of show, like this power of the history and these materials. I think you can see also from kind of like the visuals, the creativity. I think there's really so much there. So thank you all so much for sharing your different kind of viewpoints and perspectives in relation to the archive. And yeah, I know we're a little bit behind schedule, but there are quite a number of really good questions in the Q&A box here if you all want to take a look and see if there's any that you would like to answer. And just a note for the attendees, we can send out a follow-up email with a recording of the event and kind of the resources that people listed. So if there are any other resources or things that you would like to have included for everyone, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll go through after and make sure they get, they'll get shared with everyone.
So I'm happy to take the first one. Why didn't you describe yourself as politically Black? Because it never occurred to us that we had to. We were unified with the Asian community, very much connected to the struggle of the Asian youth movement, particularly in the East End, but also with people in Southall. And I think because we came from an anti-colonial struggles, many of our parents had come from anti-colonial struggles. There was that unity of understanding colonialism, which meant that we knew, as Nigel said, who our enemies were. We knew who the ruling class were. We had no misunderstanding of who we had to fight against. So there was never any need to define who we were in that sense. It was just a really organic relationship at that time. But I know now when people look back and describe what we did, they talk about people being politically Black. But for us, that didn't arise. The unity was there because of our histories and because of our understanding of what we had to do and how we had to fight. what were some of the struggles that affected race today? And the lessons of radical Black collectives say, well, that's a big one, isn't it? So I think for Race Today, I think the fact that we had a journal, the fact that we were able to, and you've seen the richness of the content, the fact that we were able to do that over so many years. I think we produced either 104 or 140 issues over that period of time. The fact that we were able to link with other communities nationally and internationally. I mean, if you came into the offices of Race Today, we'd be there, we'd probably get to work about 11 in the morning, and we'd be there till 3 or 4 in the morning. And all it was political discussion. And you would get people from Brazil popping in, you would get people from South Africa coming in, you would get people definitely from the Caribbean, we'd get people from India and from Pakistan who just wanted to talk about radical politics, what we could do, their struggles. So I think the international nature of Race Today is something which now when I look at struggles and discussion now, that's something which I know is growing again, but certainly that our international connections, I think, was something that I always point to when we talk about that. But the other thing was that we just discussed politics. We wanted, we had no set political positions on lots of things. We were in the process of learning and understanding. And now with the polarized debates that we have, sometimes you feel you've got your position and your role in life is to convince the other person of that position. Race Today was much more organic than that, much more listening. We would publish people with opposing views to articles that we'd published. We would have, people would write to us, particularly around our view of the Black defendant being central and that lawyers needed to listen to Black defendants. And then lawyers would write to us and say, but we have expertise. We used to have huge debates. There's a huge debate around Bob Marley's music. So we weren't so fixed then as I think many of the discussions are today. And so I think that's something as well, that we did have like an open forum for discussion and ideas, many of which we didn't agree with ourselves, because we did have our own ideology, I have to say. So Leila, please could you talk about the differences between Race Today and the early community like Custer, Black Power groups, Eagle, that Dark was involved in? Race is much wider in its concerns and also deeper in its sense. What helps to say this? Okay, so you're quite right. Darkus produced The Hustler and then Black Eagle. He was at that time around Michael X. I think the difference with Race Today is we began with political ideology classes. So we invited people like Selma James, who came and talked to us about the 5 pillars of capitalism. We had CLR James, who was very able to discuss with us from slavery to colonialism, and had great links with Africa. So we began, Race Today was formed on political discussion, on ideological discussions, so that all of us could be aware of what we stood for. Race Today is interesting in that many of its members like me, I mean, I left school, I went to work when I was 16. I have no formal education, I have no O-levels, nothing. And Race Today, because of the influx of members from Black Power, which was very much a kind of working class organization, which Nigel's kind of alluded to, we were a combination of working class people, Black youth, again, with no formal education. Then we had people like Farouk Dondi and Darkus, who were very much what we would call radical intellectuals. We had CLR James, and because of our international communities with people like Richard Small, Walter Rodney, Walter would sit in the offices of Race Today and discuss with us. We had a kind of very wide-ranging ideological discussions about what Race Today should stand for at the beginning. So we knew that. So I think that's one of the differences, whereas the Hustler and the Eagle were very much grassroots papers that talked about the kind of current issues on the ground. But because of our international focus and our national focus, we knew that we had to be something different. And that, I think, is the major difference in terms of the previous publications. I mean, I was on the editorial committee of Black Voice. I know the discussions we had. They were much more immediate around our issues, whereas with Race Today, we had a much longer view. And we began with an analysis of where the Black and Asian community, because at that time it was Black and Asian communities, African migration happens later, of where they were in Britain today, their history in colonial struggles, and therefore an understanding of what we could and couldn't do, but also being aware of the forces raged against us. We knew about the Community Relations Commission. We knew about local councils. We knew the desire to assimilate people, to take away some of our of the real issues that were being raised by the Black and Asian community at that time. So a lot of discussion, a lot of all the time. As I say, till 3 and 4 in the morning, you could come into Race Today and there'd be some political discussion about something. It might be immediate, it might be this person's approached us, or this group has approached us to do this. Do we want to do it? Why do we want to do it? How are we going to do it? Always saying that they had to be central to anything that we did. We did not see ourselves as leaders in that sense, which is kind of, again, something which we can talk about. It was very much the movement from below. How do we give it a voice? How do we get it out there? And then how do we support it and develop the discourse around what we're doing? Someone else can answer the question about EDI, but I completely agree with Nigel. I do not see any benefits in the current DEI and EDI practices as they're being carried out in organisations at the moment. I'm totally opposed to it.
I think from my perspective, I would say that it's part of a state move to take control of activism by appointing people who are more biddable. So once you're being paid for a job, there is a boundary on what you can say.
I think the other issue that I have is lumping everybody as some kind of protected characteristics, as if you're going to say that all their experiences are equal, when the experience of race is completely different to the experiences of the other people they call as protected characteristics. The whole language, as you said, is about control and defining how we move forward on these issues.
So I think it's, in a way, it's a red herring to even think about EDI as being about opposing racism, because it's not really. It's not about fighting racism. It's about managing an organization. Most of the reason for that in most of the organizations we work in is to avoid reputational damage rather than to make things better or to address some kind of moral imperative about being fairer. It is purely that if you don't, you risk reputational damage. And you can see that since Black Lives Matter, when everybody had to jump as an institution to make a response, to the point we are at now, where nobody is even bothered to make a response in terms of racism, how ephemeral that kind of interest is.
I know we're starting to reach time, but I don't know if anyone had any final closing reflections to share. Or I would also say, in terms of like maybe, especially for Sophia or Nigel, if you have anything to share for people who might be interested in doing archival research, yeah, Leila too, in terms of like digitizing and ongoing work. So maybe kind of closing remarks and resources for people to learn more.
I'll just say quickly, if you're in Manchester, the Ahmed Iqbal Race Archive is a great place to start. There's a working space with lots and lots of publications that are just open access. Then there are archive materials. There's some great collections there for different things. I think that if you kind of find some things there, you'll find, for example, the collection of Black Voice was not complete in the archive, which is why I went to George Padmore Institute. And I think you will find that as a kind of starting point, if you're in that geography, that's great. I'm not sure what you do if you're in the southwest of England, for example, because I don't know the archives there. And I think there is probably a piece of work between the archives to begin to join up, and digitization maybe offers the way to help do that. So there maybe is something collective to think about for the future.
Yeah, I think I'll just say that yeah, you can visit our archive at the London Archives, and I think it's really interesting, this thing around duplication and how actually some of this material is spread across lots of different archives. And I hope that people come away from this and yeah, seek out some of this material because it's so incredibly rich, and it's a real experience standing there and holding this material in your hands. So yeah, and if you want to find out more about the Institute, you can follow us on Instagram and sign up to our newsletter as well.
So for me, I'll just say there is the Race Today anthology, published by Pluto Press, which gives you a good cross-section of the articles that Race Day published in that period, and it's available to buy.
Sarah, did you have any closing reflections or advice for people?
Sorry, yeah. I think the main thing is to say, I agree with what other people have said, but essentially, yes. I mean, our archive is open 5 days a week by appointment only. So just send us an email to the main email address that's on our website. And yeah, we've got a whole range of materials. As I said, not just material that we've been discussing today, but alongside that, a number of collections in the education fields of education, activism, and also in the arts as well. And the whole lot really do cross-reference to each other. So you'll find people that are, in 1 minute they're protesting, the next minute they're painting, and the next minute they're going to be, teaching in schools. I mean, it really does cross so much, and I think people get a lot out of the archive because it's so condensed, and we haven't gone out so much and taken collections and brought them in. It's worked the other way around, so it's very much organic from inside, and it's grown from the inside. So it's we haven't got sort of it's a much more of an organic whole. Not the word organic, but you know what I mean. It's I think it actually is not more coherent than possibly going to some of the other archives that are around in the country. But I do agree actually that with what Nigel was saying about the fact that we should really look to doing a sort of joined up digitization, because we do have a lot of duplication in certain collections, and where I don't have the whole set of something, Ali might have the other half, and so on. And to actually be able to do some sort of joined up digitization project like that would be fantastic in a way, because I think it would really help bring us all together, and we have so much to share with the public and with researchers.
Totally. So yeah, just as a final closing, I know we're over time, but we'll make sure to kind of gather the resources that people shared in the chat too, and send that out in a follow-up email. And this event will also be recorded, so if you would like to rewatch, or anyone else who might be interested, hopefully, you can pass it along to them. And hopefully this can, the George Padmore Institute, the Institute for Race Relations, all of these groups have lots of more events and talks ongoing too. So there's lots more ways to learn or get involved if you're interested. So hopefully this can start the conversation, and there's lots more to discover in the collections. So I think with that, we'll just say goodbye.
Bye,
Thanks
everybody.
for coming. Thanks so much to all of our amazing speakers and collaborating organizations.
Yes. Thank you for the questions. Yeah,
Right.
thank you.
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye.